The bell starts before dawn. One slow toll, then another, then a third. Not a church calling you to prayer, an alarm clock for death. The sound rolls through alleys packed too tight for clean air, and every door you pass has the same mark. A hurried cross, chalk smeared by panic, a plea written by hands that still think God negotiates. You taste the street with every breath. Smoke from cook fires, wet wool, latrine stink. Then something worse, sweet rot, as if the city itself has bruised. A cart lurches by, wheels chewing mud, and the cloth draped over its cargo twitches as the driver hits a rut. Nobody looks too hard. Looking too hard turns you into the next passenger. Your hands shake, not from cold, from the smell. It clings, it follows. It gets into hair and bread and blankets. People in 1348 don't fear germs. They fear air that has gone bad. They fear a stink that feels alive. They fear the invisible hand that reaches through a window and squeezes the lungs. Someone behind you retches into the gutter. Ahead, a figure steps from a doorway in a long coat darkened with wax and soot. A hat sits wide on the skull like a warning sign. Round glass eyes reflect lantern light without blinking, and the beak-long, absurd, bird-like leans toward you as if it can peck the disease out by force. You've seen this face in drawings. You've worn it as an avatar. You've turned it into a symbol. Here's the first cut. This famous beak doesn't properly belong to 1348. The legend gets the date wrong because terror doesn't care about calendars. The true beaked mask rises later, in the 1600s, when plague returns and doctors build a costume to fight bad air. Still step closer. Watch the hands. Watch the ritual. Because whether the beak is early or late, the motive is the same. The city reeks. The dead pile. The living bargain with scent like it's salvation. And inside that beak, someone has stuffed a small, desperate lie. Start with the problem they think they're solving. They don't have microscopes. They don't have germ theory. They have noses, and those noses have learned a hard lesson. When the city stinks, people vanish. So they build medicine out of smell. Miasma poisoned air becomes the enemy they can name, argue with, and attempt to filter. Now build the doctor. Hat first, wide-brimmed, part status symbol, part shield. The hat says, official business, the way a badge says it later. It also keeps rain off your scalp and keeps lice from dropping directly into your hair. Next comes the coat. Waxed or leathered, treated to repel fluids and grime, because even without modern understanding, they know contact feels dangerous. Gloves follow. Boots. The whole outfit turns a human into a sealed package that can walk into a sick room and walk back out without bringing too much of it home. Then the mask. This is where the myth bites. The iconic beak is largely a later invention, popularized in the 17th century, often linked to Charles Delorme and later descriptions and engravings. But the logic behind its smell, as armor, has older roots. Even medieval advice talked about covering the face, carrying aromatics, fumigating. The beak simply turns those habits into a machine you can strap to your skull. So what goes inside? Dried flowers, strong herbs, spices that bite the tongue when you breathe, camphor, cloves, lavender, mint, sometimes a vinegar-soaked sponge acid sting as a shield against rot. And yes, ammonia enters the story too. Derived from fermented urine, it was used historically as a harsh cleaner and in other practical work. Down in the alleys, where vinegar is expensive and perfumes are for saints and nobles, a cheap cloth wetted with something biting can become a poor man's filter. The beak becomes a little chamber of denial. Fill it with a stench you control so you don't have to inhale the stench you fear. Now, before we fasten the straps and step into the house with the marked door, if you've got the stomach to stay with me while we crawl inside this mask, hit like now. Consider it the price of admission. Because the beak isn't a costume. It's a confession. They had no cure, so they built a face that could pretend the air itself was the villain. Leather first against skin. The straps pull tight around your skull, and the world narrows into 2 glass circles and a tunnel of breath. Hear that? Your own breathing changes as soon as the beak is on. Louder, closer, trapped. Every inhale drags air through a private corridor lined with crushed plants and soaked cloth. The smell hits you immediately sharp, sweet, medicinal. Almost pleasant if you forget why it's there. Almost. Cloves punch the nose. Lavender tries to soften it. Vinegar bites through the mix like a reprimand. Something resinous lingers underneath, sticky and church-like. The scent of people who want God on their side. Walk now. Don't linger. The street is watching. A plague doctor doesn't only treat bodies. He navigates suspicion. Too close to the sick and you're contaminated. Too far and you're a coward. Every step is judged by people who want you brave enough to enter their neighbor's house, never brave enough to enter theirs. At the door, the chalk mark stares back at you like an accusation. Inside, the room is dim. Straw on the floor. Damp cloth hanging from a beam. A bowl of water that smells faintly of herbs because someone is trying to turn a house into a pharmacy with pantry scraps. The beak helps for the first 2 breaths. On the third, the real smell pushes through anyway. Rot doesn't always arrive as a single stench. It arrives layered. Sweat and sickness and fear. The reek of unwashed bodies packed into one room because there's nowhere else to go. The sourness of vomit. The warm animal smell of panic. The city's invisible fingerprint on everyone's skin. Your beak fights back with its own lie. Cloves, vinegar, mint. It gives you a controlled stink. And controlled stink feels like control. The patient's family watches you like you're either a saint or a thief. Sometimes both. They want you to do something. Anything. They want your presence to mean the universe is not random. So you do what the age allows. You lean in. The beak nearly touches the patient's face, and your mask becomes a bridge between 2 kinds of air. Theirs and yours. The glass lenses fog slightly. Your breath warms the herbs. The herbs warm your breath. The machine hums quietly with each inhale. Now imagine wearing this for hours. Every breath becomes flavored. Every swallow carries traces of whatever you stuffed inside. If the beak is packed too tight, air comes thin. If it's packed too loose, the room's stench rushes in and the whole ritual collapses. Some doctors fainted, not because herbs are gentle, but because the mask is a little furnace of scent pressed to the face while you stand in a room that is itself an open wound. And then there are the substitutions. A wealthy doctor can afford imported spices, vinegar, fancy compounds. A poor hired doctor, sometimes barely trained, might pack whatever is available. Dried weeds, stale rags, pungent oils, a cloth wetted with something that stings like cleaning solution. And yes, ammonia enters the story too. Derived from aged urine, fermented and sharp. It fits the logic perfectly. If the smell is strong enough to make your eyes water, surely it's strong enough to burn the sickness out of the air. It's not romance. It's poverty dressing itself as chemistry. The beak is not one recipe. It's a category of fear. Behind the mask, your mouth goes dry from constant scented airflow. Your eyes itch from smoke and vinegar vapors. The straps rub. Sweat gathers at your hairline and has nowhere to evaporate. The costume makes you safer from splashes, perhaps. It does little against fleas. It does nothing against the city's hunger. Still, people trust the shape. They see the beak and assume science has arrived. They see glass eyes and assume you are not fully human. Therefore, you must be strong enough to stand close to death without flinching. The costume turns the doctor into an omen and official-looking messenger between the sick and whatever waits after. That's why this image survives. It's not the medicine. It's the psychology. A beak full of herbs doesn't cure plague. It does something else. It lets the wearer step into the stink without vomiting. Lets the family believe the air can be negotiated with. Lets the whole city pretend it has an answer that looks like an answer. And when that answer fails, the mask remains. Because symbols don't have to work. They only have to be seen. Here's the uglier truth. The beak isn't just protection. It's distance. A face like that gives you permission to treat people as a task. No shared breath. No visible sympathy. No human softness. Glass lenses don't flinch. A bird face doesn't comfort. It assesses. In a world where plague has turned neighbors into threats, that distance becomes power. Families plead. You respond with procedure. You touch as little as you can. You speak through leather and herbs, muffled, authoritative. The costume makes every sentence sound final. And it feeds the city's favorite habit, blaming the air. If the patient dies, the air was bad. If the household collapses, the air was poisoned. If the street empties, the air itself was cursed. Miasma theory gives everyone a villain that doesn't argue back. Meanwhile, rats and fleas do what they do quietly, efficiently moving disease through crowded neighborhoods that have no room to breathe. Your earlier sewer story belongs here like a missing organ, snapped back into place. The undercity feeds the overcity. The poor live close to filth, then get blamed for being sick. The rich buy distance and call it morality. The beak sits right in the middle, a fashionable lie worn as duty. Even the timeline itself is part of the lie. The famous beaked mask is repeatedly shoved backward into 1348 in popular imagination because it looks medieval enough to fit. In reality, historians point out that there's no solid evidence for the iconic beak costume being used during the Black Death. Its strongest documentation is later, in the 17th century, tied to recurring plague outbreaks and published depictions. That doesn't weaken the horror. It sharpens it. It means plague did not end with the first catastrophe. It returned. It trained Europe to build uniforms for fear. It taught people to dress up panic as policy. So when you ask, why was the beak full of herbs and sometimes urine? You're really asking a more embarrassing question. How little does it take for a society to accept a ritual as medicine? A few strong smells, a leather coat, a shape that looks official, a story you can repeat without understanding. Now, if you want this flagship to keep biting, if you want the next descent, from medieval stink theory to Victorian arrogance, from herbs to chloroform, from street death to anatomy theaters, subscribe. Don't leave me digging alone. Because the mask is the origin of an entire attitude. The belief that looking like a healer matters more than knowing how to heal. And that belief has outlived the plague. Take the beak off. Air hits your face raw, unfiltered, ordinary, terrifying in its plainness. For a moment, the herbs linger in your nose like a false afterlife. Then the street returns with its honest filth, and you remember what the mask was really doing. It wasn't beating death. It was negotiating your own gag reflex. The plague doctor becomes an icon because the costume tells the truth the era won't say aloud. Medicine was not in control. Religion was not in control. Government was not in control. The city was improvising while bodies disappeared. So the beak becomes a portable story. We did something. If you're going to judge these people, judge them for what they loved most: certainty. They craved it so badly, they built a bird face and stuffed it with anything that smelled like confidence. Now I'll hand the verdict to you. If you lived in 1348, if your street was marked, if the bells kept tolling, if your neighbor's house went quiet overnight, would you trust the mask? Would you let a stranger in leather and glass stand over your bed and tell you the air is the enemy? Put your answer in the comments. Don't write what sounds brave. Write what you'd actually do when the city smells like a grave and your lungs start to bargain. Because the beak isn't only the origin of an avatar. It's the origin of a habit. When medicine can't cure, it still performs. It still dresses itself in authority. It still asks you to believe. And belief, when you're scared enough, is easy to sell.